Chapter 741, Butler Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios 9 a.m., Hillston Borough, inside a high-class hotel. Klein picked up a bottle of exquisitely packaged white wine as he handed it over to the elder opposite him. "Mr. Asnia, thank you for coming. This is a gift of mine. Please accept it. At the latest, I'll make my decision by tomorrow. When the time comes, I might come and visit you in person." He was using such a euphemistic manner to inform the man that he had failed to be selected. To be frank, he was actually rather pleased with Mr. Asnia. He perfectly met his image of a butler, stern, well-mannered, professional, a high level of mental understanding, and is good at handling all kinds of thorny issues. As the oldest candidate who lived the furthest away, he had arrived half an hour ahead of time. He had been patiently waiting outside while Reback and Walter were only 15 minutes early. If not for Rhodes mentioning that the latter two allowed for additional developments, Klein felt that he would have chosen this old gentleman. After all, his main goal was to use the butler's social connections to more easily enter high society so as to make contact with the corresponding targets. The white wine was specially bought from the Intisrenzo restaurant, costing him £2 since he knew someone was destined to be disappointed while wasting money to travel to and fro by carriage. This could effectively accentuate how generous Dwayne Dantes was and how gentlemanly he was as a mysterious tycoon. In addition, he didn't think it was right to belittle a butler from a noble family. Such people definitely knew plenty of people in high society, many professional butlers, and countless servants due to their past professional experiences. They covered the entire spectrum of people, and they could affect a gentleman's image, and this was a necessary consideration for entering even higher social circles. At present, the 55-year-old Asnia had plenty of white hair. His blue eyes were ingrained with the wisdom that time had given him, so he didn't reject Dwayne Dantes' gift. He received it and glanced at it before bowing. "I love white wine from Garrett. Thank you for your kindness. Your grace is admirable." "Garrett?" "Yes, the waiter yesterday mentioned that it's a brewery in Intis's Champagne province. It's well known for producing high-end grape wine. Some of the wine of certain vintage years are considered top-notch." Sigh, a butler knows more about wine than me. "That's right. Mr. Asnia had mentioned that wine cellars are directly under the charge of the butler or a butler assistant among nobles and the rich. Does this mean that I need to have a wine cellar in the future? Wine costing £2 is at the bottom of the totem pole, while even Ormer red wine from 1330 which costs £126 isn't even considered the best. How much would such a wine cellar cost?" As he thought it over, Klein felt heavy in the chest. He began to suspect that the £2,888 he had set aside from the gold coins weren't going to last long. If not for the training he had during his time as a clown, he definitely would have lost his cool and not reply with a smile. "Your fondness for it is the greatest form of praise for me. Mr. Asnia, please invite Mr. Reback who's at the coffee house below up." Asnia didn't hesitate to agree to it. Less than 5 minutes later, Reback knocked on the door and entered the living room. This gentleman had his blonde hair combed neatly. The edges of his eyes and mouth had some wrinkles which weren't too distinct. He had a ruddy complexion and a masculine bearing. It was obvious that he was a butler who could accompany his master hunting or even fend off enemies. After exchanging greetings, Klein invited him in to take a seat while smiling. He went directly to the point. "Forgive me for being honest. I don't understand why you would become the butler of Baron Sindras. Your father was the assistant butler to the Negan family, and your grandfather was the land steward of the same family. Many of your ancestors served the Duke and his relatives until they returned to the arms of God. You should have had such a life trajectory as well. Due to Emperor Rosel's influence, the various countries in the northern continent went from using their fief and aristocratic title to indicate their nobility to just their names and aristocratic titles. Only under special formal occasions would they use the former. Of course, there were a few nobles whose names stemmed from their fiefs. Rieback gave a standard smile and answered, Baron Sindras is a newly promoted noble, an old friend of the late Duke. Therefore, I was sent to his family to help him and his family get accustomed to noble life and grasp the corresponding etiquettes. The late Duke he was talking about was the present Duke Negan's father, the Palace Negan who had been assassinated the previous year. Then, why did you leave the Baron's family later? Klein deliberated and asked. Rieback answered honestly, although Baron Sindras obtained his aristocratic title via the Conservative Party, he is one of the most famous bankers, investors, and enterprise owners in the kingdom. He was one of the earliest multimillionaires, and he had a strong penchant for the new party. He was willing to provide a certain degree of support to them, creating friction between him and the Conservative Party nobles, including the younger Duke. Therefore, to prevent the Baron from being put in a difficult position, I offered to leave. He actually tried to keep me, and he was an excellent employer. Klein nodded and asked, You believe in the Lord of Storms? Rieback seriously replied, Yes, the Lord gives us courage, zeal, and a sense of responsibility. Klein asked a few more matters about butlers and received a detailed response. Then, he said with a smile, Might I trouble you to invite Mr. Walter who's at the coffee house up? After I'm done chatting with him, I'll make the decision. You can wait in the coffee house for about 10 minutes. All right. Rieback didn't harp on the matter and immediately got up to bow. After bidding farewell, he left in a manner that exuded the air of a military man. As he watched him leave and closed the door, Klein sat back down, picked up his black tea, and took a sip. He muttered silently, If I were to choose him, I'll likely establish certain connections with the present Duke Negan and the Conservative Party. The additional development might include the situation before the assassination. Before long, Walter arrived and entered after knocking on the door. Klein first exchanged some pleasantries before asking, What conflict did you have with Viscount Conrad's butler? You should understand that I need to understand the situation. I cannot afford to risk offending a noble. Walter had a broad forehead with raven black hair and brown stern eyes, but he wasn't a person who appeared taciturn. He thought for a few seconds and said, As a butler assistant, I was responsible for the Viscount's children. During this process, due to certain matters, I was appreciated by a particular important figure. As such, I won the recognition of the Viscount, which made the butler wary against me. Later, that important figure passed away due to an accident, and as a result, the Viscount's attitude towards me changed. The butler treated me even worse, making me believe that it was pointless waiting for things to improve. In charge of the Viscount's children, and he got to know an important figure. Talim also got to know Prince Edisac from teaching Viscount Conrad's youngest son. And the prince passed away a few months ago because of the great smog of Backlund. This matches Walter's explanation. From the looks of it, this butler was one of the peripheral victims of that matter. He's rather cautious and professional. He didn't expose his former employer's negatives or reveal the matter about the prince, nor did he speak ill of the Viscount's butler. If I select him, the additional development is something to look forward to. Klein listened silently as he made some connections. He then switched to asking some professional questions, expressing his desire to enter high society. After receiving a satisfactory answer, he straightened his clothes, got up and smiled. Let me introduce myself again. I'll be your employer, Dwayne Dantes. Walter immediately bowed and said, Sir, how may I be of service? He kept maintaining a stern, old-fashioned, and unperturbed demeanor, as though these were the professional traits of a butler. 2 matters, Klein replied with a chuckle. First, help me hand this bottle of white wine to Mr. Rieback who's waiting at the coffee house. Please express my apologies and gratitude to him. Second, hire a solicitor to write up a professional contract that will include you and the other servants. All right, sir. Walter bowed once again. As Klein handed the white wine over, he asked, Walter, how many servants do you think I need to hire in order to not appear improper? While Walter received the bottle of Garrod white wine, he replied without any hesitation, you should first determine where you will be living. Only then can you know how many servants you actually need. Oh, do you have suggestions? My requirements are simple. I wish to live in Northborough, as I'm a pious believer of the goddess. Klein drew the crimson moon on his chest in passing. According to the information I read on the papers and magazines, a garden villa in a high-end district has to be at least £3 a week. That makes it £156 a year. Although there are no direct numbers, I can infer that the suburb's best garden villas cost about £2 a week. A high-end apartment with a few rooms and halls would cost about the same. It's been mentioned that that's relatively extravagant, a place where only the richest of the middle class can afford to rent. Yes, from that, I can preliminary estimate the rent of a tycoon's house. It's expensive just thinking about it. Back in Tingen, Benson, Melissa, and I spent 13 solely a week on a gardenless terrace house. There was an additional 5 pence for the use of furniture. In the house I lived in Minsk Street, it didn't even reach £1, sigh, so be it, even if it's £3. I have £2,888. It shouldn't be a problem renting a slightly better one. No problem at all. While awaiting Walter's answer, Klein silently recalled the information regarding rental costs. He began calculating how much he needed to pay every week and every year. Walter considered it for 2 seconds before replying in a serious manner, "Sir, you can choose 32 Buckland Street. It's close to St. Samuel Cathedral, and it's a 3-story manor with more than 10 rooms. It comes with a stable, a servant's quarters, and a rather large garden. Living nearby are baronets, House of Commons members of Parliament, and senior lawyers. The interior design is especially tasteful. There are plenty of famous paintings and antiques. All the furniture and wares are enough to accentuate your identity. You can rent it for a year first. If you find it satisfactory, you can consider buying it entirely." Sounds pretty good. Klein asked with a smile, "How much is it to rent for a year?" Walter sternly and skillfully reported the number, including the use of furniture, £1,261 a year. Klein was glad that he wasn't drinking any tea, or else he would have spewed it all across his butler's face. He mustered nearly all of a clown's control in order to prevent any abnormalities from showing on his face. Chapter 742, Decided Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. After a brief moment of silence, Klein raised the black tea and took a sip. He said with a smile, "It's something that can be considered, but Emperor Roselle once said to never be in a rush to make a decision. Only after repeated comparison will one receive the best answer. Are there any other options?" Walter, who wore a white glove, replied without any abnormality to his expression, "Phelps Street would also satisfy your request. I recall that Unit 9 is available for rent. It's a 2-story villa with more than 10 rooms. It comes with a stable, the servants' quarters, and a small garden. The furniture and wares are relatively old, but they're considered decent. The annual rent is £220. That's quite a reasonable price." Reasonable. However, Phelps Street means that it's less than 100 meters away from St. Samuel Cathedral. Although this does help in being right under their noses, many of the pedestrians will be nighthawks. It would be very inconvenient for me to leave and return, making it easy to make mistakes. Klein, who originally had a budget of about £160, suddenly felt £220 was a pretty good price after undergoing the catharsis of the garden manor's price. This made him suspect whether butler Walter had deliberately offered him an expensive choice at the very beginning. Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, "Any others?" Walter replied without showing any signs of impatience, 160 Buckland Street is also available for rent. It's a 3-story house which also comes with a garden, a stable, servants' quarters. There are more than 10 rooms, but its location isn't as good as Unit 32. The decorations, furniture, and wares can be considered decent. It has an annual rent of £315, £315. The rental fee flashed past Klein's slightly numb mind. He asked in thought, "What do you suggest?" At that moment, he had already decided on an answer, but as an employer, he wasn't in a rush to express his decision. This was because he would easily be belittled if his decision had a slip-up in common knowledge. Walter seriously thought and said, 160 Buckland Street. In comparison, the neighbors here will be more helpful in entering high society. As for Unit 32, it's overly extravagant. To rent it immediately will make your surrounding neighbors believe that you lack the necessary self-restraint, making it seem inappropriate. To put it simply, to rent a house costing £1,260 a year so easily will make neighbors define me as an ostentatious nouveau riche. To a tycoon who's trying to enter high society, such a reputation will be terrible. Klein sipped his black tea and asked with a smile, "Then, why did you offer me the selection of 32 Buckland Street?" Walter unhurriedly bowed and said, "Honorable sir, I'm only a butler. My responsibility isn't to decide, but to present all suitable options and give you certain suggestions for your consideration. In a situation where I'm unaware of your exact preferences, I have to do my best to provide you with all possible options." Very professional. He's likely worried that Dwayne Dantes is a nouveau riche who enjoys flaunting his wealth, so he first gave the choice of 32 Buckland Street as a way to probe me, so as to adjust his suggestions and management style. Klein smiled and said, "Let's eliminate Unit 32. We shall choose one of the two. Before I make the decision, I'm accustomed to paying a visit. Let's head off after lunch." "Yes, sir." Walter continued wearing that stern, old-fashioned expression. South of the bridge, Harvest Church. Emlyn White was wiping the silver candle stands as he was mulling over the clues provided by Miss Magician. A secret beyonder gathering. That's equivalent to providing no clues. It will be rather difficult to pursue the matter. And I won't be able to participate in the gathering in short notice. Emlyn observed himself in the silver stand's surface as he combed his hair. Then, he put down the wiping cloth, retreated to the first pew in the cathedral, and sat down as he watched Bishop Yutravsky praying seriously before the altar with his gaze unfocused. Thoughts came to his mind as they occasionally created sparks. Emlyn suddenly grasped a detail. Why would a puppet that garners the primordial moon believer's immense interest happen to appear? Moon puppet. This feels like it's bait. See, could it be a trap designed by Russ Bathory and the others? Emlyn's eyes lit up as he suddenly stood up. Russ Bathory was a sanguine baron who was participating in the hunting competition. He was viewed by Emlyn as his strongest competitor. The more Emlyn thought about it, the more he found it as a possibility. This was because he knew that Bathory was an antique enthusiast, one who especially enjoyed collecting all sorts of strange trinkets from the southern continent. After pacing back and forth a few times, he curled the corners of his lips and chuckled. He silently said, "I have no way of entering the Beyonder gathering to seek out the location of Windsor, but I can monitor Russ Bathory and finish off the target before he does. I look forward to his expression when that happens." Yes, Miss Magician's clue is indeed worth £100. Just as Emlyn was feeling abnormally excited, Father Yutravsky ended his prayers, walked over, and looked down at him. He said with a gentle voice, "Our piousness is not in our language, but in every detail of our body language. You were not being focused enough today. Wipe the candle stand again." "All right," Emlyn replied, suddenly feeling ashamed. After the priest turned to walk to the confessional, he snapped to his senses as he muttered, amused and incensed, "I'm not pious at all. I don't have to appear pious." Rows of straight intis parasol trees lined both ends of the street, making the streets appear beautiful and tranquil. With his golden-laid cane in hand, Klein slowly walked out of Unit 160. He silently drew a breath and turned to look at Walter. "Tell the owner that I'm very satisfied. I'll temporarily rent it for a year. We might move to a better place later, such as Empress Borough." His words hinted at his ambition to obtain an aristocratic title, as Empress Borough was a place where the nobles gathered. As for why he didn't rent half a year to save on money, it was because such high-end estates only accepted long-term contracts. 1 year was the minimum. To be frank, if money wasn't an issue, Klein had quite a liking for the house. Its lawn was clean, and the garden was beautiful. The furnishing was befitting, and the wares were exquisite. There were plenty of bedrooms, sufficient furniture, and many washrooms on every floor. Even the stables and servants' quarters at the back weren't shoddy work. It was the best residence Klein could have ever imagined in the past. Walter immediately replied, "I'll hire a solicitor in a while." "Sir, what specific requests do you have regarding servants?" Klein strolled underneath the Intis parasol trees and smiled. "I'd first like to hear your suggestions." Walter thought for a moment before saying, "Sir, you will need a housekeeper regardless." During the interview, Klein had mentioned that Dwayne Dantes wasn't married and had no children, nor did he have any mistresses in Backlund, therefore, he didn't need a lady's maid. Dwayne Dantes nodded gently without expressing any intentions. Walter continued, "Her duties would be to manage the female servants and the expenses of the household." "Sir, you can't leave everything to me or the same person. Balance is an art in politics, and it's also a good method when managing a household. Emperor Roselle once said that absolute power definitely corrupts. I'm confident in myself before money, but it's only confidence." Very honest. "A housekeeper is needed. She'll cost about £30 to £40 a year." Klein nodded. "Okay." At that moment, Walter was walking behind Klein to his side. He extended his hand to stop a rental carriage. "On the carriage," he continued, "I will get the Family Servant Assistants Association to produce a name list for the selection of the housekeeper. You shall choose her personally, and I won't provide any suggestions. Based on the current residential situation, you will also need a steward who can be male or female. You will need a valet, a lady's maid in charge of the bedrooms, and 2 chambermaids who will be in charge of the living room and activity room. 2 footmen to valet guests, a parlor maid, a scullery maid, 2 laundresses, and 2 handymen. Apart from those, you will need a cook, 2 gardeners, 2 coachmen or 1 coachman and an assistant coachman. If necessary, you can have an additional attendant, a steward's boy, a nursery governess, and a second cook. You currently do not have any carriages, but you'll definitely have 2 in the future. A 4-wheeled carriage costs about £300. A 2-wheeled one costs about £100. As he listened to his butler introduce the required servants in detail, Klein's mind went numb. He didn't wish to do the accounts on how much he needed to spend. After all, it was paid on a weekly or monthly basis, and not an annual basis. Ignoring the attendant, steward's boy, nursery governess, and second cook, there will be 10 to 11 male servants, and the female servants with the housekeeper will number about 9 to 10. It's basically several times what I calculated. Each week's expenses will exceed £10. This can only be determined after all of them are hired and their salaries are negotiated. There's also the carriage. Klein's mind couldn't help but drift and he saw Walter's mouth moving non-stop. Seeing the staid and extremely dignified Mr. Dwayne Dantes nodding from time to time, Walter subconsciously broadened the topic. "In the future, you will also need to rent a manor in the suburbs to entertain friends to have a wonderful weekend over there. There's no rush. It can wait until you hold several dances and banquets at Unit 160, sir. Do not mention housemaids in front of the neighbors of this street. Only those with salaries below £500 a year will hire housemaids because they're unable to hire enough female servants to handle the different parts of the household." Klein listened numbly as he reflexively wore a warm smile. Back at the hotel, he watched Walter leave before he sat back down, his expression collapsing. When it was 20 minutes to 3, Klein rubbed his temples and slowly got up. He went into his bedroom and prepared to begin this week's tarot gathering. Chapter 743, A Diary Page Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios above the grey fog, in the palace with the towering dome. The fool Klein glanced at the sun, who had been pulled up ahead of time, as well as the world who had been conjured in advance. Emanating a little bit of his spirituality, he made contact with the crimson star representing justice, the hanged man, the magician, the moon, and the hermit. Beams of light rose up as relatively blurry figures appeared on the two sides of the long bronze table. Justice Audrey, who had just returned from a tree farm leading to the castle, had already changed into a dress. Her sleeves were layered in laces that were filled with lustrous pearls. Like clockwork, she stood up, lifting the corners of her skirt as she curtsied. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Klein instantly felt better as he nodded with a smile in response. Meanwhile, he couldn't help but sigh. To act like a tycoon costs so much money. I wonder how huge the expenditures are for a noble like Miss Justice. After all the members exchanged greeting nods, he looked at the hermit, as he knew that this pirate admiral would likely provide him with new Roselle diary entries. As he had expected, Catlia spoke out, "Mr. Fool, I only managed to find one page of Roselle's diary." "Just one page? Shouldn't Queen Mystic be able to produce an entire book anytime she wants?" Klein, who had been met with repeated tribulations recently, remained composed as he nodded. "That won't be a problem." Catlia immediately conjured a yellowish-brown diary page. It then seemed to tear through the spirit world and enter Mr. Fool's hands. Klein deliberately looked down, and he was surprised to discover that the beginning of the diary entry didn't have a date. That means that it's a second page from another diary page. Why didn't Bernadette give me the first page? She should be able to figure out dates. After all, old Neil succeeded. Did she not? Or were the diary pages thrown into a mess, and she wasn't able to restore them to the correct order? Does this mean that Emperor Roselle's belongings were vied for by various factions after his death? Some were lost, and at that time, Bernadette was unable to stop them. Only when she became Queen Mystic did she have the ability to get involved. As Klein guessed, he quickly began reading the content on the piece of paper. How surprising. The fourth epic history divulged by Mr. Dorr is getting more and more interesting. This unlucky B***** who's trapped amidst the storm and lost to the depths of darkness told me that the Black Emperor died once and had revived again. Surprisingly, this matches what was said in that ancient secret organization. Back during that gathering, they said that the 9 secret mausoleums of the Black Emperor weren't all destroyed. Even if this deity who walked the land were to perish, he could resurrect. Even if all 9 mausoleums were destroyed, as long as the order left behind by the Black Emperor remained, he had the ability to strangely resurrect. Only with the birth of a new Black Emperor would he be completely obliterated, never to appear again. According to Mr. Dorr's description, the Black Emperor had 3 stages in the process of his resurrection. First is that the uniqueness leaves the person possessing it, turning into an abstract concept. Second is when the subjects of the Black Emperor hear his mighty voice again. The third is that, when fused with the uniqueness, the Black Emperor would reappear in the astral world. The 3 sequence 1 beyonder characteristics would automatically be returned into the Emperor's hands. This is an order that other true deities are unable to distort or prevent. This way, the sequence 1 Prince of Disorder of this pathway, Blood Emperor, and Night Emperor would be in a rather awkward situation. They might instantly perish, falling back to sequence 2. Mr. Dorr said that back then, the Lord of Storms and the Evernight Goddess had chosen the Night Emperor. They helped him switch to a neighboring pathway, the Judgment Pathway. As such, the Tudor Trunsoist United Empire fractured. And Blood Emperor Alista Tudor, who was pushed into a corner, made a crazy decision. It was to switch to a non-neighboring beyonder pathway. He paid the cost of losing his reasoning, becoming a lunatic so as to forcefully advance and become a true god. I have to say that this decision is filled with irrationality. It's almost impossible for it to happen, but Mr. Dorr told me that Alista Tudor eventually succeeded. The craziest true god was born. It's truly fascinating, but Mr. Dorr didn't go into the details since he kept it from me. I asked him which was worse, lunacy or death. He said that it was an obvious choice, death, because as long as one was alive, it wasn't impossible to recover even if one was completely mad. He laughed and gave an example. A crazy true God could use his instinct to mate with all kinds of living beings, giving birth to all kinds of descendants. Through this process, if he was lucky enough, the conflicting beyonder characteristics would be purged. The lunacy would slowly disappear with time as he improves bit by bit. Mr. Dorr deliberately didn't say if there would be any remnant problems, nor did he explain why almost no one made such a choice, but I could tell that there was definitely some huge hidden risks. I have to say, Mr. Dorr's understanding of true gods far exceeds my imagination. Before he was exiled, he might have made an attempt to reach sequence 0. It's no wonder he shows such contempt to Zeradal, and he has zero respect for the various true gods. This only makes me more unwilling to let him return to the real world. There's plenty of information. It's no wonder that Bernadette deliberately chose this diary page. Wait, why did she choose this page? What important meaning is there behind it? Did problems begin to slowly happen to Emperor Roselle from that day until he eventually went mad? Mad. Could it be? No way. Roselle's situation back then was similar to Blood Emperor Alista Tudor. His pathway was severed, and the neighboring pathways were blocked by either people or items, making it difficult to reach them. Could it be that under the immense stress, he made an irrational choice like Blood Emperor, and he had attempted to switch to a non-neighboring pathway? This way, the craziness in his later years was a result of him truly losing his reasoning, not a result of the defamation from others. It's no wonder Bernadette hated and betrayed him but is also trying to figure out the truth. From this angle, certain things have become very interesting. Roselle forcefully ascended to the throne and declared himself emperor, his declaration of the civil code, using the order from Earth's 18th and 19th century to replace the existing order. He wantonly spread his speeches and promoted his sense of aesthetics. I really belittled this senior of mine. I always thought he was cosplaying Napoleon or Caesar for his own entertainment. So it was him making preparations to become the Black Emperor. No, I saw a few pages of his diary back then. His thought processes were clear, and his emotions were stable. He could even communicate with various noblewomen of different ages. He might not have made the final decision back then but was subconsciously leaving a way out for himself. The civil code probably wasn't deliberate. As a usurper to the throne, declaring new laws is necessary, and from what he could use for reference, the civil code was what matched the situation flow of history. The actions of him declaring himself emperor later on must be something Bernadette found incomprehensible. She found it difficult to accept. As Roselle's most beloved child, she probably noticed certain abnormalities with her father before he declared himself king. Hence, she chose the longest diary page during that period of the emperor's life to give to Admiral of Stars. Klein couldn't help but make connections, as though the heavy history hidden deep in the fog was being turned over to reveal a page filled with blood and iron. This made him curious about the final trigger that made Roselle go mad. Meanwhile, he also resolved some of his puzzlement. So the resurrection of the Black Emperor is done this way. It's very similar to my previous guess. In the fourth epoch, there was actually a Tudor Trunsoist united empire which was supported by the 6 deities like the Lord of Storms and the Evernight Goddess. The 2 thrones in the ruins in William Street can be explained then, as it belonged to the United Empire. According to Mr. Dorr, the 6 deities chose the Night Emperor, resulting in the United Empire fracturing. Then, who helped the Blood Emperor capture or kill the 3 Sequence 1 hunters? Among them, Red Angel Medici was likely stronger than the Blood Emperor from back then. Primordial Demonis. Death. Primordial Moon. Dark Side of the Universe. Mother Tree of Desire. Klein tried listing possibilities for his guesses, but he had nowhere to begin. He quickly made the diary disappear as he smiled at the hermit. "What's your request?" Catlia frankly answered without holding back, is there someone else apart from Emperor Roselle mentioned in this diary entry? This question made Audrey turn to look at Mr. Fool. Her eyes sparkled as they were filled with curiosity. Even her ears seemed to prick up. Alger was also very interested in the matter. That person definitely wouldn't be an ordinary person to be mentioned in Emperor Roselle's diary. Klein could guess at their thoughts as he couldn't help but lampoon inwardly. It's only because this diary entry was specially selected by Bernadette. If it were any other entries, I'd have to tell you that the other people mentioned are Demonis A, Demonis B, Hunter A, Hunter B, some aristocratic ma'am, some aristocratic lady. After 2 seconds of consideration, Klein, who was leisurely leaning back into his chair, replied with a smile, Mr. Dorr. Mr. Dorr. To be addressed by Mr. Fool in such a manner, it must be an existence that's close to a god, right? Audrey figured out Mr. Dorr's status from the tone and words used as she obtained an affirmative answer. Cadlia and company also had similar ideas, but no one knew who Mr. Dorr was. They looked at each other only to be met with the shaking of heads. Seeing Furs and the other members have a uniform reaction, Klein deliberately looked at the lady and chuckled. You shouldn't be a stranger towards him. Ah. Furs wore a confounded look. She didn't feel like she knew a so-called Mr. Dorr. This person seemed to be of a very high level. I'm no stranger to Mr. Dorr. Apart from Mr. Fool, the only one I'm no stranger to will be the 7 deities. Furthermore, I've only been to the cathedral of the god of steam and machinery. As Furs was feeling puzzled, she quickly recalled which high-level existence she could have made contact with. Since there weren't many, she quickly eliminated all the other possibilities. Her eyes lit up as she made the connection with the contents of what Mr. Fool had originally said to her. She looked at the end of the bronze table that was enveloped in grey fog. Her voice trembled as she asked, Is he the one who created those ravings during the full moon? Klein chuckled with a nod. That's right. Ravings during the full moon. What's that? Audrey and company exchanged looks as though they were ordinary people who had just entered the mysterious world. They had never heard of any so-called full moon ravings. As expected, Miss Magician isn't simple. She actually knows about Mr. Dorr, and she's aware of the corresponding matters. My initial judgment wasn't wrong. Although the beyonder ingredients she needs are relatively low, there are too many possibilities. Cadlia nodded her head indiscernibly, planning to ask more about Mr. Dorr during the free exchange. She was also willing to pay a certain price for it. An existence who could be seriously mentioned by Emperor Roselle and addressed by Mr. Fool in a rather formal manner, had to have many secrets involved. It was definitely nothing simple. At that moment, Furs silently exhaled. She felt that she was one step closer to removing her curse. At the very least, I now know who's producing the full moon ravings. She lowered her gaze and sincerely said to Mr. Fool, Thank you for your reminder. Klein didn't speak further, nor did he point out that Mr. Dorr was suspected to be the ancestor of the Abraham family, Bethel. After surveying around the table, he said with a casual tone, You may begin. With that said, he immediately controlled the world to say with a hoarse voice, I have 2 mystical items for sale. 2 mystical items. Mr. World has recently been able to produce something of great value at every gathering. He lives up to being Mr. Fool's blessed. Audrey poignantly sighed in amazement as she cast her eyes towards the other end of the long bronze table. Clearly, she was looking forward to the world's explanation of the powers of the item. Alger was tempted, as he knew that the mystical items the world sold were definitely up to mark. However, thinking back to his lack of savings, with the secret to the primitive island already given to him, all he could do was silently sigh, feeling depressed. He still had 5 hours before arriving at Pasu Island, and he was yearning to immediately fly over and complete his report. Then, he could leave the area, find an Obninsk to advance to Ocean Songster. Once he did that, he could explore that primitive island with the world, obtaining the relevant rewards, so as to ease his financial situation. As for Derek, Emlyn, and Furs, although they were somewhat curious about the mystical item, they lacked the desire to actually purchase it. One of them could submit an application to the 6-member council to select one mystical item which the City of Silver had for becoming a Sequence 6. The other wished to receive the rewards from the hunting competition, and he wasn't certain what the rewards would be, therefore, blindly purchasing items made it easy for redundancy and wastage to happen. Furthermore, he only had the £2,000 to £3,000 needed for the reward for clues. As for the last one, she didn't even have the money to purchase it. Cadlia looked at Gehrman Sparrow with piqued interest as she considered the possible origins of the mystical item. If it was suitable, without clashing with the 2 mystical items she had, she didn't mind buying it. Seeing how the 2 major clients appeared interested, the world gave a deep chortle. One of them is Scales of Luck. It's what I named it. As he spoke, he requested Mr. Fool to conjure the silver necklace that had an ancient coin dangling from it. After introducing its mystical effects and negative effects, he glanced at Audrey and specially gave a warning. I suggest that Beyonders lacking in combat strength don't purchase it. Although it can allow one to avoid a fatal blow, the subsequent backlash is equally dangerous. One needs to have sufficient combat strength and sharp reactions to have a chance of surviving the backlash. Thinking back to how she took on more of a support role, one that leaned towards control and influence, as well as her lack of combat experience, Audrey nodded with slight disappointment. It was an indication that Mr. World was right. Mr. World is pretty nice to me and the Tarot Club members. He's willing to give such a warning. This would have prevented him from selling it. Audrey adjusted her understanding of the world. The hermit found the description extremely familiar. She had apparently heard of the effects of the Scales of Luck. Scenes quickly flashed through her mind before finally being fixed onto a few particular scenes. Cadlia's eyes constricted as she blurted out in surprise, "Senor? It's likely Admiral of Blood Senor's necklace. It looks similar, and the effects are identical. Where did Gehrman Sparrow obtain it? What did he do this time? Did I miss some important news over the past few days while the future was out at sea?" Cadlia instinctively suspected that the world had stirred up something massive again. Klein thought about it and controlled the world to laugh deeply. He's already dead. He wasn't against letting Miss Justice and company realize that Gehrman Sparrow was equivalent to the world. After all, there were already 2 people who knew, and he didn't plan on using this identity frequently in the future. A powerful member who often took action made the rest of the Tarot Club feel a greater sense of belonging. He's already dead. Gehrman Senor killed Senor. In the previous battle, I only held a slight advantage over him. Cadlia discovered that she was increasingly unsure of the world's strength. Although Admiral of Blood's bounty was higher than hers, it was mainly because he did more evil deeds. In terms of her strength and mystical items, Cadlia was slightly stronger. It wasn't as if she had never had any conflict with Senor. She had held the advantage several times, but she had failed to mortally wound him. As for Gehrman Sparrow, she believed that he was inferior to her when they met on the future. He was even unlikely to defeat Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy in her optimum state. Only when this crazy adventurer completed his advancement and hunted Slaughterer Curtius did she determine that he truly had the strength of a pirate admiral and was someone at her level. However, a week had just passed, and Gehrman Sparrow had completed another hunt. He had finished off Admiral of Blood Senor, who was one of the top 3 pirate admirals. Cadlia knew that she herself was incapable of doing so. He's dead. Admiral of Blood Senor is dead. Gehrman Sparrow did it. He's killing 1 Sequence 5 a week. Furthermore, each one of them is stronger than the last. Even if he's Mr. Fool's blessed, isn't such strength too ridiculous? Especially when he hasn't become a demigod. Was it done with the help of the other blessed? The church should have the relevant records, but at my present position, I won't be able to read them. Alger was secretly alarmed as he automatically began to consider a reasonable explanation. Audrey was still in her family castle in East Chester County. All she read was a few newspapers and magazines that involved the entire nation, so she wasn't aware of what happened at sea. However, from Ma'am Hermit's tone and words, she could tell that Mr. World had done something incredible again. Senor. Mr. Hanged Man had apparently mentioned it before. It's Admiral of Blood's name. Mr. World finished off this pirate admiral and obtained his mystical item. How amazing. That's practically what I dreamt of. Back when I had heard of the 7 pirate admirals, I had imagined myself becoming a powerful beyonder to adventure out into the sea to capture all of them and hand them over to the kingdom. So our tarot club is already this powerful. I have to investigate who killed Admiral of Blood. That way, I'll be able to figure out Mr. World's real identity. But would he be unhappy about that? No, he mentioned it himself, so he's likely willing to let himself be known. Audrey thought in glee. Furs, who needed to read various newspapers to obtain material, instantly recalled a piece of news that she had recently read. Admiral of Blood Senor was suspected to have been killed by the crazy adventurer, Gairman Sparrow. See, could it be that Mr. World is the crazy adventurer is the crazy adventurer with a bounty of £50,000? Furs felt respect. She began to believe that he had the ability to help her finish off the Aurora Order Oracle, the suspected traveler, Louis Veen. Emlyn shared similar feelings as Audrey. This was because he seldom read minor newspapers. His area of activity didn't include any information-gathering grounds. As for Derek, he wasn't one bit surprised. He had long confirmed that Mr. World was extremely powerful. Even though Mr. Hanged Man had once mentioned that Admiral of Blood Senor was very powerful, he believed that Senor was inferior to Mr. World due to a lack of any direct impression of him. Cadlia said after a few seconds of silence, "How much do you plan on selling it for, or what item would you like to trade it with? If the price is suitable, I can consider it." Great. There's finally someone who's interested. Klein, who was burdened with immense financial pressure, controlled the world to say, 12,000 gold pounds. He was afraid Cadlia would be frightened away by such a price, so he quickly added, "You can choose to pay a portion with gold coins. That way, all you will need is 11,000 pounds. Klein believed that Admiral of Stars, who had plundered gold-carrying ships from various nations, definitely had some gold reserves. Even if she didn't have much, she could exchange for them from other pirates. This would allow him to make his first payment to Miss Messenger. As for fishing up sunken ships, due to the existence of the Church of Storms, Klein believed that any easily discoverable ships would have long been found by the irascible Storm Brothers. Sea King isn't weaker than Sea God, and there had to be a handful of people at the level of Sea King inside the Church of Storms. Cadlia did a silent calculation and said, £4,000 worth of gold coins and £6,500 in cash. We can close the deal if you are agreeable. The money wasn't easy to raise, even for her, but she had the Moses Ascetic Order backing her. Spending about £10,000 to obtain the Scales of Luck was something that no secret organization would object to. As expected of a pirate admiral. Unfortunately, I have to avoid the Rose School of Thought, and I can't clean out Admiral of Blood's ship. Klein made the world carefully consider it before saying, "Deal." Chapter 745, Knowledge is Money. Translator, Atlas Studios. Editor, Atlas Studios. Finally. At the instant that they reached a deal, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He felt the pressure on him significantly decrease. Although Miss Messenger had said that the 10,000 lone gold coins could be paid in installments, and she hadn't specified when it would begin, Klein didn't wish to drag out payment for too long, afraid that he would incur the wrath of Rionette Tynker. After all, she was a spirit world creature at the demigod level. If she really ended up mad, she had the means to make things difficult for her employer even if she was restricted by the contract. Besides, the cost of acting as a tycoon is just too high. The salary of 20+ servants and the corresponding costs is only just a tiny portion. There's still the carriage, horses, wine, gifts for neighbors, banquets, and investments to conceal my status, each of them more expensive than the last. If I don't save up enough cash, I'm afraid I'll go bankrupt and be unable to continue. Sigh, £6,500 with the cash I already have should be able to last until I confirm my target, right? No, the experiences from the past 2 days have proven to me that I should never use my own understanding to imagine a tycoon's life. I probably still need another £5,000 to £6,000 to barely maintain it. Klein wished to raise his hand to rub his temples, but he ultimately held back. He soothed his mind and made the world look around again before saying with a hoarse laugh, "The second item is biological poison bottle." He used a relatively succinct description to describe the conjured brownish translucent bottle. He emphasized the few poisonous traits it had, how long it took, how to prevent the effects ahead of time, and any negative effects it gave while carrying it. Audrey felt a chill down her spine as she felt a little embarrassed. She felt the former because of the terrifying poison that made one rip off their skin and flesh, while the latter was a result of the strange aphrodisiac effects it had on a wide area. This is truly a crazy mystical item. It's the type that needs to be prepared ahead of time to show its full effects. It's quite useless against an ordinary spectator because observation and reading minds can help the low-sequence beyonders of this pathway detect the danger ahead of time and make the necessary actions. However, there's no need for me to do so. If I were to detect danger ahead of time, I can directly cry out for my guards. Besides, I don't like such effects. It will easily harm myself. Audrey, you're already a mature and rational beyonder. You can't buy everything you see. Audrey seriously considered it for a few seconds before giving up on asking the price. Seeing Miss Justice not ask for the price, Klein couldn't help but let the world add, £5,200. Audrey bit down on her inner lips as she politely shook her head. I wish to obtain a mystical item that's more offensive in nature. Spectator was a pathway that lacked any direct attacks in the early stages, one that was only effective at affecting or controlling their targets. £5,200. Alger, Furs, and Emlyn repeated the price softly in unison before they shirked all thoughts about it. £5,200, Catlia suddenly seemed to recall something as she paused obviously. She then quickly added, "It's not necessary for me. Ma'am Hermit seems to be afraid of something." Audrey acutely read her emotions. For a split second, Catlia felt that the biological poison bottle had a lot of synergy with poison expert Frank Lee. Furthermore, their powers didn't overlap too significantly, and they even complemented one another. She was wondering if she should purchase it for her first mate since he had saved up quite a bit of money, but considering how Frank Lee might come up with terrifying experiments after obtaining the biological poison bottle, she trembled and gave up on the idea. She didn't wish to see the deck of the future produce the children of the crew, the kind that mood. After the gathering is over, I'll write to Miss Sharon and tell her that Admiral of Blood's necklace has been sold. All that's left is the biological poison bottle. Klein hid his disappointment, and after some thought, made the world speak. I have a book of secrets. It's a book on mysticism left behind by the southern continent's shaman King Klarman. It's suitable for mid-sequence beyonders who have pretty good foundations. The price is £1,000. Knowledge is money. Having undergone the teachings of Mr. Fool, Mr. Hanged Man and the other members of the psychology alchemists, Audrey was tempted. She now had an extremely solid foundation in mysticism, and she had a desire to improve further. The psychology alchemists will likely teach me some mysticism knowledge of a higher level in the future, but it will definitely not be all-encompassing and will be limited to the domain of the mind. Audrey easily convinced herself as she nodded. This is exactly what I want. Furs was equally interested, but the thought of how much money she had made her close her mouth. As for the other members, they didn't lack such knowledge. As expected of Miss Justice. She doesn't bargain at all. My bottom line was actually £800. No, I don't have one at all. It's not like knowledge can only be sold once. Klein happily made the world chuckle. Deal. However, I have to remind you not to pray to the primordial moon. It will make you become a lump of squirming flesh that only knows to wildly mate with different creatures to produce all kinds of children. Of course, you cannot pray to other secret existences. It will be equally dangerous. Audrey was terrified by what she heard as she couldn't help but change her seating posture. She then calmed down, turning to look at the end of the long bronze table. She said firmly, "I'll only pray to Mr. Fool when holding a secret ritual." She had spoken with utmost sincerity and without any hypocrisy. Miss Justice really worships and trusts the Fool. Klein felt touched and a little ashamed. This was because the sea god Scepter's domain didn't overlap with the primordial moon. He was unable to provide an effective response in certain rituals. All he could do was attempt to use some of the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog as feedback. Following that, as the Fool, he expressed his attitude on the matter, "Very good." Meanwhile, having achieved his goal, he made the world say, "I have an interrogator beyonder characteristic here for just 1,200 pounds. How many items does he have?" Furs was dumbfounded. Considering how Zio was still lacking in money and lacked the corresponding formula, all she could do was retract her gaze and pretend as though she hadn't heard him. As for the interrogator beyonder characteristic which was in the hands of Mr. Fool's subordinate, she didn't believe that he would keep it that long for her. Seeing no one respond, the world coughed and said, "I'm done." Just as he said that, Alger, who had been waiting all this time, looked at Katlia and said, "I wish to know where Obninsk sea monsters that do not belong to the Church of Storms are." Obninsk sea monsters that don't belong to the Church of Storms. The hanged man really isn't a member of the Church of Storms. Katlia frowned a little before easing them. "I'll help you ask. We'll talk about the price when I have actual clues." "All right." Alger silently sighed. A few seconds prevailed before Emlyn said to Furs, "I'll pay you the 100 pounds for the clue today." "Thank you," Furs said without a delightful expression. Mr. World's transactions were all in the thousands or more. It made her feel a little numb to such a pittance. Emlyn then looked towards Derek. "The crystallized roots of the tree of elders and supplementary ingredients you need have been acquired. Hand me the list of resources and monsters around the City of Silver, and I'll choose a few items of equal value." "Oh, they cost me a total of 2,000 pounds. Adding my payment of 200 pounds, it will be a total of 2,200 pounds. Emlyn only wished to obtain things that he could quickly sell, otherwise, he wouldn't have much money. "All right. Thank you, Mr. Moon." Derek was delighted, for he suddenly felt that Mr. Moon wasn't that irritating after all. He quickly conjured the corresponding list and handed it over to Emlyn. Emlyn casually flipped through the piece of paper and suddenly felt that it wasn't right. This was because just this piece of information had extremely high value. It presented the detailed information and corresponding resources around the City of Silver. "I remember that they didn't pay to see this list." Emlyn couldn't help but glance at the hanged man Alger and the hermit Katlia. At that instant, he seemed to understand something. When he looked at the sun again, Emlyn had a newfound sense of superiority, as well as a sense of guilt he couldn't get rid of. He cleared his throat and said, this, also this." Derek seriously memorized what was said, and he indicated that there was no need for him to return to the City of Silver, as those could be gathered around Afternoon Town. Following that, Audrey inquired about clues to the fruit of an illusory chime tree, but she received a disappointing answer. When the transactions came to an end, it didn't need the Fool to announce it, as they automatically entered a free exchange. Alger looked towards Little Sun and said, "Are you still in Afternoon Town?" "Yes, but we will be returning to the City of Silver soon. The new expedition team arrived today." Derek not only answered Mr. Hanged Man's question seriously, but he even offered a tidbit. "I've already told the chief that while clearing out the Afternoon Town monsters, I obtained the potion formula for Notary." The Hanged Man nodded slightly and said, "What was his attitude?" "He only said, 'Very good.'" Derek carefully recalled what had happened. Alger chuckled when he heard that. You can be at ease. Your chief is very happy to see you grow. In contrast, he will be more wary of the elder council's shepherd. He didn't continue on the topic as he informed all the members of a piece of news. Recently, many pirates have been heading to Bansi Harbor. They discovered that it has already been completely destroyed. Even if it's rebuilt, it would take several years. Chapter 746, Same Night Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. After hearing the hanged man's description, Klein couldn't help but recall Red Angel Medici and the evil spirit found in the underground ruin. However, he didn't share the discoveries of his exploration this time. Firstly, there wasn't a need to, and secondly, it involved Miss Sharon. As for the other members, they had already learned that Bansi Harbor had been destroyed. And since the hanged man hadn't revealed any new information, there was no need for them to reply to the matter. Realizing that no one was saying anything, Alger glanced at the world before looking back. He said calmly, "That's all from me." The hermit immediately turned to look at Furs. "Ma'am, what do you know about Mr. Dorr? I can pay for the corresponding piece of information." Furs, who didn't wish to expose her problems, suddenly hesitated when she heard the latter half of the sentence. She was momentarily tempted. Payment. I wonder how much Ma'am Hermit can pay me. I don't really know much about Mr. Dorr either. Furthermore, some of the knowledge stems from Mr. Fool's words. Furs looked to the end of the long bronze table once again and asked, "Honorable Mr. Fool, can I tell her?" As he met her every full moon, Klein knew that Miss Magician's financial situation wasn't in the best of states, so he smiled with a nod. Yes. Furs silently heaved a sigh of relief, turned to Catlia, and said, £500. You can request for a private exchange. Catlia didn't bargain. After some thought, she said, "There's no need. Just say it directly." She wished to see if the other members would be able to figure out more about Mr. Dorr from Miss Magician's description. Furs nodded and deliberated over her words. I once obtained a mystical item that helped me traverse the spirit world. But after using it, I would hear strange ravings every full moon or blood moon. It would inflict an excruciating pain upon me that puts me on the verge of losing control. And according to Mr. Fool, these ravings come from Mr. Dorr. She paused and added, he might be asking for help. So Furs has been silently suffering such pain. She usually doesn't show it, acting as though she greatly enjoys life. As Audrey subconsciously pitied her friend, she began wondering how she hadn't discovered anything abnormal about Furs with her spectator powers. Mystical item that can traverse the spirit world. Ravings during the full moon. Suspected to be asking for help. Catlia repeated Miss Magician's key points as she nodded with satisfaction. Thank you for your description. She then swept her gaze at the other members, regretfully realizing that no one else had any additional reaction. The free exchange continued and soon came to an end. Watching the other members leave and helping them complete a few transactions, Klein returned to the real world as he sat in his reclining chair, feeling relaxed as he rested for a while. Following that, he walked to his desk, and he picked up a pen and paper to write to Sharon. He told her that the scales of luck had been sold, leaving only the biological poison bottle for sale, as well as the lunatic beyonder characteristic. After folding the letter, he wrote the information such as 126, Guard Street, Hillston, and Ma'am Miriam. Then, he opened his iron cigar case and made Admiral of Blood Senior silently appear beside him. This wraith acted like a valet as he humbly picked up the letter on the table before vanishing from the room. A few streets away, a letter appeared out of nowhere in a mailbox as it fell inside. East Chester County, the Hall Family Manor. Audrey looked at the mirror with her unfocused green eyes as the contents of the Book of Secrets filled her mind. This knowledge formed an illusory book that appeared upon being recalled. She could then flip to the corresponding page simply by willing it. This was a result of Klein directly using a portion of the powers from the mysterious space above the gray fog to create a product that was a fusion of information bestowment and the seer's dreamscape ability to recall it. It could last a week or two. And this was sufficient for Audrey to finish reading the Book of Secrets. If she had anything she couldn't recall in the future, she could always request for a bestowment. Mr. Fool's condition seems to be improving. Audrey thought in delight as a twinkle gradually returned to her eyes. She stood up, walked to the door, and said to the bored golden retriever who was sprawled on the ground outside, "Susie, you don't look ladylike enough this way." Susie looked around warily and twitched her nose before saying, "This is the most standard action during hound training. But you aren't a qualified hound." Audrey lampooned as she said with a smile, "I thought you would reply, Audrey, I'm only a dog." Susie replied in a serious manner, "An excessive use of repeated words makes it easy for others to grasp your personal habits and mental gymnastics. Audrey, that's what that book on psychology wrote." Audrey was momentarily at a loss for words. At that moment, she saw her father, Earl Hall, with his valet and attendant walking up the castle's staircase. Even though it was sunny outside, this place remained dark and gloomy. There were even candle stands that had been lit. They were embedded in the walls as they illuminated the stairs. "This castle is just too old. I think it needs a major renovation," Earl Hall casually grumbled to his daughter. Audrey nodded in a demure manner and said, "Yes, my dear Earl. This is precisely why I dislike this place. It makes me feel like I'm slowly rotting away. But I'm actually spending £13,000 a year to repair this place," Earl Hall said with a regretful chuckle. Audrey glanced at Susie and smiled at her father. "Father, is there something for me?" Earl Hall pointed at the papers in his attendant's hands. "A telegram from Backlund. Someone is selling 10% of the Backlund Bike Company. Are you interested? I think this industry has a very bright future. And it's currently far from reaching its lowest estimated prospects." Bike? Audrey found the word rather unfamiliar as her eyes darted around, her expression slightly confused. Earl Hall smiled at his daughter. "It's a kind of machinery with two wheels that allows a person to ride on it. You can understand it as a carriage for the ordinary person. In Lone and Backlund, the majority of the population doesn't mostly comprise of the nobles or businessmen, but the ordinary people who engage in labor work. Next would be the type of people with some technical skill and standing. This is the target audience of the bike. They have absolute numbers, as well as the required ability to purchase it. Even if 10% of them are willing to buy a bike, it will lead to quite a wonderful development for this company. Yes, they hold the corresponding patents." Audrey trusted her father's foresight, and she could understand the prospects as described by him. She nodded gently and said, "How much would the 10% shares cost?" "According to preliminary estimates, the Backlund Bike Company is currently valued at £50,000. This is because the product's advertising and sales campaign still needs time to develop further. Therefore, you can't naively believe that the 10% shares are only worth £5,000. I suggest that you bid £8,000 in the first round of bidding, with a bottom-line price of £15,000. I will send people to help you in this matter," Earl Hall answered succinctly. "About £10,000. I've mostly used up the cash for this month." Clearly a little embarrassed, Audrey said, "Father, I won't be able to produce that much money on such short notice. And selling my shares, estate, collections, or await their profits will require some time." Earl Hall laughed out loud. "There's no need to go through so much hassle. You can mortgage your shares in the Backlund Munitions Corporation or Pritz Commercial Marine Company to the bank for a short period of time to obtain the cash. Once the matter is complete, you can mortgage the shares in the Backlund Bike Company for a longer period of time, using the mortgage loan to pay off the first loan. This way, you'll only need to pay about a week to 2 weeks of relatively high interest to complete the trade. And the bike company's dividends a year would be enough to cover the interest of the long-term loan. You'll then be able to patiently wait for its value be recognized, and that's a high-probability event. Although Audrey had never received a complete education in commercial finance, she wasn't too unfamiliar with such matters with a major banker as her father. Some thought had allowed her to understand the entire process as she asked as a form of confirmation, that's to say, I only need to pay about £200 to £300 to obtain 10% of the bike company's shares. Or lower, Earl Hall said with a smile. Audrey understood her father. As the largest shareholder of the Varvat Bank, as well as the fourth largest shareholder of the Backlund Bank, he had the ability to help his daughter to obtain the most reasonable interest for a short-term loan. Thank you, my dear Earl. Audrey smiled as she curtsied. Under the moonlight, with the dark blue seawater nearing the color of black, Alger Wilson stood at the bow of the ship as he watched the silent outline of Pasu Island. This was the headquarters of the Church of Storms, a land where a true God's grace was showered. As a middle-ranking member of the church, Alger recalled himself coming here only 3 times. The first was him finding the Blue Avenger and after advancing to Seafarer. The second was his report last year, and this time. And very long ago, as a mixed blood with dark blue hair, he had been selected to enter the headquarters to be a member of the children's choir, but without any talent in singing, he was soon dismissed. He returned to the chapel on the island where he was born to be a servant. And the priest there was an extremely violent superior to his subordinates. Every time he recalled that piece of history, his expression would turn extremely livid, fortifying his thirst to become a high-ranking member of the church. Amidst the wind, the Blue Avenger silently cruised forward into the harbor. In Backlund, which had also ushered in the night, Emlyn White, who was dressed in a starched formal suit and top hat, infiltrated the residence of another sanguine baron, Russ Bathory. He believed that Russ would be taking action soon to reel in his bait. And for a sanguine, a night with the crimson moon was very suitable for hunting. After an unknown period of time, Emlyn's eyes suddenly lit up. He saw a figure leap from a window facing the house's rear before landing silently on the ground. Chapter 747, First Blood Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Under the crimson but gloomy moonlight, Emlyn took out a metal bottle, twisted its lid, and downed it. Then, he seemed to transform into a shadow as he drifted over the surface of the wall, quickly and silently following Russ Bathory. Sanguine were always known for their speed. The two barons ran through the sides of the dark alleys and streets, one after another, spending more than half an hour to arrive at the messy and dirty East Borough where they stopped in front of an old apartment. Seeing Russ Bathory choose to climb the pipe, and using the most stealthy approach to head for the 3rd story, Emlyn slowed down his pace and didn't rush to follow behind him, as he would be easily discovered. After 2 seconds of serious consideration, he picked up a translucent perfume bottle, twisted it open, and pressed down on it, scattering the liquid inside it onto his body. This potion only had one use: eliminate his smell to make it identical to his surroundings. After putting down the bottle in his hand, Emlyn raised the brass bottle and downed the liquid inside. "A potions professor sure is troublesome," he mumbled, looking down as his hands became transparent. The brass bottle seemed to be floating in front of his sleeve. After Emlyn stuffed the tiny bottle away, all that was left was a formal suit, a top hat, and a pair of leather shoes without any buttons or laces. They formed a human shape as they moved about. Another completely transparent bottle resembling a perfume bottle flew over and floated in midair as it pressed itself, spurting the potion inside onto the clothes. Following that, the suit, top hat, and shoes turned faint and completely disappeared. After completing his invisibility, Emlyn glanced at the apartment where Russ Bathory had entered. He silently climbed a pipe, and he chased after him with extreme speed. While the window was still ajar, he floated inside like a transparent cloud, without causing so much as a stir. He hid in the corner as he watched the thin-faced but charming Russ Bathory search for the target. The latter slowly frowned since the place was empty. There wasn't even a mosquito, much less a person, despite the former becoming active in the past week. And this sanguine baron had already confirmed that the moon puppet was here. Suddenly, a creaking sound broke the frozen silence. The apartment's main door opened as a woman in a black dress leisurely walked in. When she saw Russ Bathory, she asked with an ethereal voice, "Who are you looking for?" Emlyn looked in the direction of the sound, and he saw a dark-skinned, long-browed face with soft outlines and a drooping mouth. It was none other than his target Windsor. However, in Emlyn's eyes, this primordial moon's devout believer had certain differences from her portrait. He discovered that her eyes, eyebrows, and mouth were curved up, like they were mimicking the crimson moon. And her forehead, cheeks, neck, and every layer of skin that she exposed had patches of withered grass and flowers. Man, what did Russ Bathory sell to her? Why would she become like this? Emlyn jumped in fright as he felt the hair on his back stand up. Meanwhile, withered grass mixed with dried flowers grew from the floor, walls, door, and ceiling in swaths. They began to isolate the room from the outside world, creating an extremely strange scene. Once Russ Bathory caught the smell of danger, he didn't attempt to converse with her. Without any hesitation, he took out a metal bottle and downed the liquid inside. Pa! He threw the bottle as his body dragged out afterimages as he pounced towards the mutated Windsor. His fingernails extended as they swirled with black gases. The withered grass and dry flowers that were embedded in Windsor's face made her look like a huge doll. She met him at an equally fast speed, clawing at Russ Bathory without any aversion to being injured. Bang! 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 After a series of collisions, Russ Bathory was sent flying back as he slammed into the wall. His sleeves were ripped apart, revealing the bone-deep scratches on his skin. And in the midst of his flesh, the withered grass and dried flowers slowly grew from the inside out. What a monster! This was the first time Emlyn was encountering such an enemy. He huddled in a corner and nearly forgot to help his kinsman. He didn't rashly appear as all kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. As he observed the battle between Russ Bathory and Windsor, he considered how he should deal with the situation. The strangest of all is the withered grass and dried flowers. Withered grass and dried flowers. They're likely afraid of fire. Emlyn's heart stirred as he immediately abandoned his invisibility, took out another metal bottle, twisted its lid, and downed it. He then spewed out all the liquid in his mouth. The grayish-red liquid ignited upon contact with air, extending its scorching flames to the side. The flames stacked upon each other as the fire extended. Instantly, they engulfed the room in a scarlet ocean of fire. Amidst crackling sounds, the withered grass and flowers were ignited one after another as they rapidly spread the flames to their own kind. In just a few seconds, the sealed environment was on the brink of destruction. As for the grass and flowers on Windsor's body, they were also turning aflame. At this moment, Russ Bathory had a gaping hole dug through his chest, making him lose a great portion of his combat strength. He was relying on the Sanguine's extraordinary recovery ability to barely hold up. Seeing his enemy as a flaming torch, Emlyn acutely noticed that her aura was weakening. He didn't hesitate to lunge forward, circle around Windsor, and deliver several clawing swipes. Beneath his feet, wisps of black gas rose and swirled around the primordial moon believer like chains that bound her vitality. Bang! 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 Intense and short bursts sounded as the two figures suddenly closed the distance. All movement within the scene had vanished in the end as Emlyn grabbed Windsor's throat with his left hand, raising her up. After hesitating for a second, he saw her hideous appearance and snapped her neck. Pa! A thin, miniature wooden puppet embedded with withered grass and dried flowers fell from Windsor's body as the flames in the apartment gradually died out. Emlyn yanked Windsor's mutated head, turned around, and faced the heaving Russ Bathory. He then pressed his free right hand to his chest, and he bowed with a smile. "Thank you for your help." Seeing Russ Bathory instantly turn furious and helpless, Emlyn added in great delight, "Remember to hand over the puppet and the Beyonder characteristic to Lord Nibs. They might be problematic." After saying that, black gases coagulated behind him, turning into two illusory bat wings. With a whoosh, Emlyn flapped these wings as he turned to fly out the window and land in the dark, nearby alley. When he landed, he quickly converged the black gases and turned to look around. Seeing that Russ Bathory hadn't followed him, Emlyn heaved a sigh of relief as he pressed his fist to his mouth. As he coughed, he mumbled, "I hate fire. I hate smoke." He was just about to leave Eastborough when he felt a chill run down his back. Emlyn's mind instantly tensed up as he held on to Windsor's mutated head, slowly turned around, and looked at the shadows in the corner. He first saw a very tiny figure before identifying it. The body was thin and long, akin to a wooden pole. Its eyes and mouth were curved like a crescent, and its surface was embedded with plenty of withered grass and dried flowers. It was none other than the moon puppet from before. "It's targeting me. What the hell is this? I'm still very far from where Lord Nibs stays. It's really dangerous outside." Thoughts surfaced in Emlyn's mind as he felt his spine turn cold and his muscles turn tense. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, he suddenly had an idea. He stared at the moon puppet, and he murmured in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck, can't a man have some sleep in the middle of the night?" Klein sat up as he rubbed his temples in fury. He quickly left his bed, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and he entered the space above the grey fog. He then took his seat that belonged to the fool. "It's that fellow, Emlyn White." Klein gave a glance as he curiously emanated his spirituality, touching the crimson star that represented the moon. He then saw a stiffened Emlyn, and he saw the thin, strange puppet looking straight at him. The puppet was cloaked in a rich but illusory crimson moonlight. They were undulating like a tidal wave, making a connection with something high in the sky. At this moment, the crimson moonlight was spreading silently, enveloping Emlyn White within. "There's a problem. There's something wrong with this puppet." Klein, who could see more with the grey fog's aid, didn't hesitate to summon the sea god scepter from the junk pile into his hand. The blue gems on the end of the bone scepter lit up one after another, emitting a blinding luster. After chanting Mr. Fool's honorific name and seeking his assistance, Emlyn felt his already cold blood turn colder. It felt like it would slowly freeze into ice. This made his body rapidly turn stiff as he watched the moon puppet stumble and swagger towards him. At this moment, a silver bolt streaked down into the alley, causing all the gloom and darkness to scatter. "Pa!" The lightning bolts sizzled into a ball of lightning and landed on the moon puppet, drowning it in a swath of silver. The burst of light dissipated immediately as the strange puppet was left charred black. It lost its decorations as it collapsed. As for Emlyn, his blood no longer froze as it resumed its flow. With him quickly recovering from the stiffness, he knew that Mr. Fool was watching. He hurriedly asked softly, "Do you need, no, what can I sacrifice to you?" He always believed that Mr. Fool adhered to the principle of equivalent exchange. Therefore, he believed that he needed to pay a corresponding price for requesting his assistance. After a brief silence, he saw the boundless grey fog and the faint figure behind it. He then heard a lofty and magnificent voice, "That puppet. All right." Emlyn took 2 steps forward, bent down to pick up the puppet and cleared up the scene before quickly leaving Eastborough. As for Klein, he cautiously used a paper angel to disrupt any divination before returning to the real world. Just as he was planning to head back to bed, he suddenly discovered the moonlight brighten outside as it seemed stained with blood. Klein walked to the window in puzzlement. When he looked out, he saw that the crescent had turned full at some point in time. It was scarlet red like blood. Another blood moon. Blood moon. Alger Wilson looked up at the sky as he steadily walked into the lightning cathedral ahead of him. This was the place he would be giving his report tomorrow. And in the middle of the island, at the peak of the towering mountain, there was another cathedral named the Chasm of Storm. It was the headquarters of the Church of Storm's headquarters, the holiest of holy temples. Inside the lightning cathedral, the high and spacious dome arched continuously. There wasn't any blank space, with gold and blue as the main colors. It made anyone who walked beneath it subconsciously feel that the place was sacred and solemn, thus, making them bow their heads. Alger Wilson often made contact with a secret existence, and he often gathered in the palace of a deity's residence. As a result, he no longer had a longing for this. He wasn't as respectful as before, but he still had to put on an act. Like the other sailors around him, he kept his head down as he lightened his footsteps without even daring to breathe clearly. In the silent atmosphere, they were led by the priest all the way to the clergyman's quarters at the back of the cathedral, with each of them getting a room. After closing the door, Alger saw the sanguine moonlight shine into the window. It made the environment turn cold and sinister, as though countless wraiths seemed to be observing the real world through a thin curtain. Every time the blood moon appeared, one's spirituality would be enhanced. Powers that stemmed from spirituality and hell would receive a significant boost, while the negative emotions of living beings reached an explosive state. The higher the sequence, the more obvious it would be. Faintly, Alger heard sobbing, low shouts, and whispering. This was completely different from the solemnity he previously felt in the lightning cathedral. Illusory arms appeared before his eyes as they reached outwards from the walls, floor, and ceiling, like a three-dimensional pale forest. Alger knew of the abnormalities of the blood moon, so he removed his captain's hat without panicking at all. He entered the bathroom and washed his face. During this process, he suddenly heard a distant singing voice. The singing voice was indistinct, as though it came from the middle of the island. It kept echoing endlessly as though it was right beside Alger. It didn't make him feel horrified, for it was akin to a woman who was away from her family and loved ones, singing slowly and sadly as she looked at the surging tides. Alger pulled at a towel and wiped his face before cocking his head to listen. He gradually frowned as he took out a small iron box from his priest robe's inner robe and placed it close to his ear. In it was the ocean songster Beyonder characteristic he had purchased from the world. He suspected that the residual mental imprint on it was temporarily enhanced by the blood moon. As the metal box came close, the singing by Alger's ears instantly became partially clear, melancholic, sorrowful, wistful, and painful. But apart from that, there was still the ethereal and ancient voice sounding from it, forming a clear boundary with the clear singing as though they were in a duet. Whose voice is that? It sounds like an elf's. An item in the church that stems from the elves. This ocean songster Beyonder characteristic on me comes from an elf. Alger nodded as he came up with a theory. Due to them sharing the same sailor pathway, the Church of Storms had always been in search of elvish relics. They were used to concoct potions, made into sealed artifacts or isolated underground. Those with relatively fewer negative effects were rewarded to clergymen, therefore, it wasn't odd that something similar would be stimulated on the night of the blood moon. If it's a mystical item, there wouldn't be a problem. If it's a sealed artifact, it means it's definitely not simple if the voice can penetrate the isolation barrier. Alger reined in his thoughts, brushed his teeth, and went to bed. He soon fell asleep and had a dream. After an unknown period of time, Alger suddenly felt a little lucid, vaguely aware that he was having a dream, but he automatically sized up his surroundings. He discovered that above him was rippling dark blue seawater which was stacked up layer after layer and blocked the view of the sky. Ahead of him was a beautiful palace made of coral. It was tall, spectacular, dark, and gloomy. Alger subconsciously walked towards the palace, walking into the open doors. Inside were columns of coral that held up an exaggerated dome. The walls and dome were filled with murals depicting the terror of a storm. Over 100 meters away, there was a throne embedded with sapphires, emeralds, and lustrous pearls above a 9-stepped staircase that was extremely striking. Alger looked over and saw a woman in a complicated ancient dress sitting on it. Her hair was black and held up into a bun. Her facial outline was soft, and her features were exquisite. She had a beauty that seemed timeless. The woman's expression was core and her ears sharp. Her deep brown eyes looked down at Alger from a commanding position. In her hand was a golden wine cup with complicated patterns. Alger was just about to say something when her eyes emitted silver light resembling the bright flash of lightning, tearing through the dream. Phew! Alger sat up and subconsciously gasped for breath. He found the dream both blurry and clear at the same time. The woman's appearance was blurry, as well as the details of the murals and coral palace, but her eyes that contained lightning and her sharp ears were clear. A high-ranking elf? Under the effects of the blood moon, her relics resonated with the ocean songster beyond a characteristic I have, resulting in it influencing my dream. As Alger guessed, he wondered which item it would be. Due to his limited standing, the number of sealed artifacts and mystical items he knew were limited. However, he knew certain knowledge that others didn't know, so he quickly thought of a possible target. Calamity Kohinam. The Book of Calamity she left behind has likely been sent to Pasu Island. After making the report and departing, I'll seek Mr. Fool's advice and see if there will be any unexpected influences regarding this matter. Alger didn't dare recite the Fool's honorific name in the Church of Storm's headquarters. After daybreak, he didn't show any signs of abnormality. Under the servant's lead, he entered a room with a long table, and he was questioned by 3 mandated Punisher deacons. Among these 3 deacons, only one of them possessed dark blue hair. This was because this wasn't a necessary change that would happen from consuming the Sailor Pathway potion. However, this trait would quite stubbornly be passed down, just like the elves. Many of them with black hair would end up with blue hair. Nowadays, mixed bloods with elvish blood mostly had blue hair. Alger sat at the end of the long table as he systematically answered the deacon's questions. He mentioned what he had done at sea, what he had planned to do, and what he had succeeded, as well as his failures. And this would be compared to the description from his crew to prevent anyone from lying. Towards the end of his report, the deacon with dark blue hair glanced at Alger. He asked with a hoarse voice, "Do you know Admiral of Stars Catlia?" "Not only do I know her." Alger was nearly taken aback as he answered after some thought, "I met her at the pirate convention." The deacon didn't harp on the question as he directly said, "Think of means to get to know her. Try to investigate Gehrman Sparrow's situation from her." "So that's how it is. It's because Gehrman hunted Admiral of Blood?" Alger deliberately asked, feigning his ignorance, "What did Gehrman Sparrow do again?" The dark blue-haired deacon said in a peeved manner, "He nearly destroyed Byam." "Alright, this isn't something you should know. In summary, remember. Gehrman Sparrow is a very dangerous person. There's a secret cult backing him. That organization has a demigod that's at odds with the Rose School of Thought. Nearly destroyed Byam. A demigod in the organization. At odds with the Rose School of Thought. Alger deliberately didn't hide his shock. He originally imagined that a focus was placed on Gehrman because of his hunting of Admiral of Blood Senior, but who knew that the reason was far more complicated and ludicrous than he had imagined. What did Gehrman Sparrow do? When I pass by Byam, I should find the actual spot to take a look. Also, isn't our tarot club's archenemy the Aurora Order? Isn't Mr. Fool always targeting the true creator? Why did it change? No, why is there the additional Rose School of Thought? Alger muttered to himself inwardly. As for the tarot club having a demigod, he wasn't surprised. He even found it logical. How could an ancient existence not have a demigod under him? Besides, back when Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos died silently in a strange manner, he was already convinced that Mr. Fool had a high sequence blessed. Thankfully, my meeting with Gehrman was very secretive, otherwise, things would be troublesome. Alger listened in silence without asking any questions. Like before, he accepted the missions and got up to leave the room. Backlund's North Borough, outside 160 Backlund Street. Servants stood in 2 rows to welcome their master's arrival. With white hair at his temples and deep blue eyes, Dwayne Dantes wore a tailcoat and a top hat with an inlaid gold cane. Together with butler Walter and valet Richardson, he walked in between his servants and arrived at the entrance of the three-story building. Waiting there was housekeeper Tanaja, who he had long selected. She was in her early 40s, and her hair was tied neatly. She had ordinary looks but wore an experienced demeanor. She wore gold-rimmed glasses and a black and white dress which was different from the other maidservants. From the information received and the interview, Klein knew that this lady was born in East Borough. She was a believer of the Evernight goddess, and she had chosen to be trained by a charitable organization by the church at the age of 15, making her become a qualified maidservant. After more than 10 years of hard work, as well as the free lessons from the night schools, she was promoted from the lowest-ranking maidservant in a tycoon's household to a lady's maid. She later followed the tycoon's daughter when she got married, and she became a housekeeper until the family met with a financial crisis, forcing her to leave. She was extremely experienced when it came to managing a household. After this lady signed the contract, she received £1,000 from Dwayne Dantes as petty cash for the month before entering an argument with butler Walter on whether they should purchase or rent a carriage. From her point of view, since Mr. Dantes's goal was to enter high society and move into West Borough, or even Empress Borough, a carriage needed to be custom-made to not appear inadequate. Before that, they could rent a high-end carriage for a year and wait until there was hope of him becoming a noble before they had one custom-made. It was a more reasonable choice that didn't waste money or appear inadequate. She convinced Walter, and of course Klein. This was because renting a high-end carriage with the horse costs only £88, and a two-wheeled carriage costs only £42. Of course, someone who controls the household's expenditures needs to be someone who's good at accounting. Klein felt poignant as he smiled at Tanaja before stepping through the three-story house's door. This was the stage for which the tycoon, Dwayne Dantes, would be acting on. Chapter 749, The Moon's Authority Translator, Atlas Studios Editor, Atlas Studios. Upon entering the house, the first thing Klein saw was the foyer. It was very spacious here, with several chairs and umbrellas placed there. Furthermore, the furnishing was elegant, and the decorations were befitting of his status. If he hadn't known of the structure ahead of time from his inspection, Klein might have imagined it to be the living room. After passing through a second main door, the sight before his eyes opened up. It was a huge hall that could accommodate dozens of dancing guests. In the middle of the hall was a brightly colored, thick, and plush carpet. Surrounding it were spaces covered with bright marble tiles, with a piano, stone sculptures, and other decorations decorating the hall. There were also stone columns that held up the second floor with inlaid ornaments. To the left was a series of floor-to-ceiling windows, and beyond them was a lush, green lawn and blooming garden. To the right were walls, wooden doors, and a corridor that led to the lounges, storerooms, washrooms, kitchen, and butler's room, etc. The hall was 2 stories high, and there was a crystal chandelier hanging down from the ceiling. It instantly made one imagine what it would look like when night fell. Ahead of him were 2 staircases that led to the second floor. The winding corridor here was square in shape, and the emptied-out section in the middle happened to be where the carpeted hall was. All Klein needed to do was hold a cup of wine and stand behind the railings of the second floor, and he could leisurely take in the sights of a ball below. There were many rooms on the second floor. There was a living room, an activity room, a dining room, washrooms, a billiard room, and many bedrooms. If any guests needed to stay for the night, they would stay there. Similarly, on the second floor, there were 2 staircases that led to the third floor. That was where Dwayne Dantes stayed. There was an exaggerated master bedroom, with a bar counter-equipped open room that allowed one to sunbathe and enjoy the scenery. There was a study which could be deemed as a miniature library, as well as 2 changing rooms and small bedrooms for the valet and the maid on night duty. There were also rooms meant for the household members and bathrooms, but Klein was currently a single man. As for the other servants, they lived in a terrace house behind the main mansion. In another direction was the stable. The mansion's underground area was equally spacious with a huge storeroom and wine cellar. Taking off his coat, Klein stood on the balcony in the half-open room on the third floor with his back straight. He took in the sights of the surrounding streets and couldn't help but sigh inwardly. There really is a reason why it's so expensive. The rent of £315 really can't be considered a waste. He had already paid a year's rent yesterday afternoon, and he could only force himself to enjoy this place that he rented. Meanwhile, he had also directly paid Walter a year's salary of £115. As it was very possible that he would flee once he obtained the Antigonus family's notebook, he didn't want to affect his butler's livelihood. By the same logic, he had long paid housekeeper Tanaja her annual salary of £42. It allowed this lady to realize how generous Mr. Duane Dantes was, as well as how mannered he was. Through the two head servants' negotiations and hard work, they hired all the servants. The annual salary of a male steward was £30, his valet, Richardson, was £35, the two footmen in charge of valeting guests and serving at the dining table each received £30, the two ladies' maids were £18 each, the two chambermaids were £12 each, and the two handymen were £12 each. Apart from them, the cook was £30, the assistant cook was £15, the scullery maid was £13, the parlour maid was £11, the nursery governess was £25, the steward's boy was £10, the two coachmen were £25 each, the two gardeners were £20 each, the two laundresses were £10 each, all for a total of £413. It cost about £8 a week. Together with the two head servants' annual salary, Klein needed to pay £570 a year, making it approximately £11 a week. This was still without including the expenditures for food, clothes, and all kinds of daily necessities. I'll pay £10 to £20 a week without any income the moment I open my eyes. Klein did a mental calculation as he forced himself to cast his gaze onto the garden. In the afternoon, he had paid off the rental fee for the two carriages and servants' first week's salary. Together with him giving housekeeper Tanaja £1,000 for the daily expenses, he only had £1,286 and 18 gold coins left. However, he would receive the payments from Miss Justice and Ma'am Hermit within the week. I wonder how long that £1,000 can last Tanaja. Just to store up the required alcoholic beverages for the balls would cost a few £100s. The rich Mr. Duane Dantes fell into deep thought and could hardly extricate himself from it. To calm his emotions, he decided to head above the grey fog while the butler and servants were busy with handling the household chores. He wanted to study the strange puppet which Emlyn White and sacrificed. After the blood moon happened, Klein had no choice but to return to the mysterious world and pull furs into it. He resisted the urge to sleep as he listened to her drone on about her daily life in Backland. After everything was over, he was just too tired. He accepted Emlyn's sacrifice, and after confirming that there wasn't anything weird, he returned to the real world and collapsed into bed. After straightening his stylish dark-colored vest, Klein walked to the door and said to the awaiting valet, Richardson, I have a habit of sleeping in the afternoon for 45 minutes. I don't want anyone disturbing me. Yes, sir, Richardson answered humbly. He was an illegitimate son with mixed blood. His father was Loanese, a supervisor at a manor, while his mother was a native from East Balham who was a slave in the same manor. After he was born, he was met with discrimination and bullying. This resulted in a weak and submissive character, and because he was good-looking, he was suitable for valeting guests. He was selected by the manor's master to be a valet before being brought to Backland. After both houses of the Lone Kingdom had abolished slavery, he found himself out of a job. All he could do was seek the help of the City Family Servant Assistance Association. Before Klein, he had served 2 households and committed some mistakes, but he did build up a wealth of experience. He caught Butler Walter's notice, and he became Duane Dantes's valet. After looking at Richardson, who stood straight and tall, with a height that was almost identical to himself, Klein indiscernibly shook his head and sighed. This guy that can clearly be a celebrity with his looks can only be a servant in this day and age. Furthermore, he's such a tall man, but he appears cowardly and weak. However, this can also be considered an advantage. He's obedient, silent, and submissive. He does whatever his master instructs him to do, and he will absolutely not dare to make his own decisions. If I only have a valet with me requiring him to handle all kinds of matters, Richardson will definitely not be up to mark. However, I still have butler Walter and so many other servants. He can handle the other matters with his experience and capabilities. Without musing further, Klein locked the door and returned to the side of the reclining chair. He took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered above the grey fog. He sat at the seat of the fool, and he beckoned with his hand to make the charred moon puppet fly over and land before him. After scrutinizing it, Klein didn't discover anything odd about it. Hence, he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the divination statement, its origins. Putting down his fountain pen, Klein waited a few seconds before picking up the piece of paper and leaning back against his chair. My spiritual intuition didn't stop me from making the divination statement. It means that the latent danger of the moon puppet isn't as bad as the Rose school of thought beyond her characteristic. Klein mumbled as he skillfully recited the divination statement. In the grey, hazy world, he saw an altar with a circle of fiery torches around it. On the altar, there was what he suspected to be human skin with traces of blood everywhere. In the middle were 3 candles and a few puppets that resembled thin wooden poles. These miniature puppets had curved eyes and mouths, as though they corresponded to the crimson crescent in the sky. Therefore, they continued hanging their creepy smiles as withered grass and dried flowers remained embedded in their bodies. A priest in a dark red robe was circling the altar with heavy steps, as though he was dancing a dance created by an epileptic patient. At some point in time, moonlight gathered and shone on the puppet as it increased in brightness. Towards the end, it resembled the gentle ebbing of water waves. The ritual quickly came to an end as the priest picked up a thin puppet and walked to the human body bound to a frame beside him. Instantly, he stabbed it through the body's eye socket. Amidst tragic cries, the scene quickly changed. The dead man with the moon puppet in his eye socket was buried somewhere in an orderly manner. The scene once again skipped and showed further development. Every full moon or blood moon, the moon's glow would scatter over the grave, seeping into it like water as the surrounding darkness turned gloomy. Klein opened his eyes and adjusted his seating posture. He had a general idea of the moon puppet's origins. It came from a prayer ritual to the primordial moon. It was a ritual lasting for centuries. Over the past few centuries, they had absorbed the powers of the crimson moon, mutating bit by bit until they were exhumed by the colonists. They usually didn't exhibit any oddity, and something only happened and a primordial moon believer activated them with the correct method. As for what would happen, Klein had no idea. In a particular sense, these primitives are equivalent to the primordial moon's chosen ones. Last night, after I smote one to death, that evil god was enraged, thus, causing the blood moon. Klein gently tapped the model table's edge as he came to a preliminary judgment. The primordial moon's wrath directly changed the moon's phenomena, making it a blood moon. If this theory is right, it means that in the domain of the crimson moon, the goddess is inferior to the primordial moon. She might only have the title in name as she grasps a grade 0 sealed artifact. Klein nodded slightly as he attempted to divine the weaknesses of the moon puppet. This time, he saw sunlight and lightning. This means that the beyonder powers in the sun domain and lightning from the storm domain are best at dealing with it. As Klein interpreted the information, he threw the moon puppet into the junk pile and returned to the real world. An hour later, Walter, who was wearing a starched suit and white gloves, knocked on the door. He bowed and said, "Sir, I'll be printing your name card in a while. They will be sent to the neighbors along with some gifts. They will take a few days to observe to determine your situation. If they're willing to accept you, they would send gifts and invite you to be their guests." Does your name card need a title added? Title. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Klein lampooned as he replied with a smile, Merchant Dwayne Dantes from Desi would suffice. Walter nodded and said, based on your wishes, I'll immediately arrange for you to have etiquette lessons. The focus will be on dancing, and I've hired a professional teacher. Chapter 750, Attraction. Translator, Atlas Studios Editor. Atlas Studios. Having read many magazines, Klein knew that the social life he wanted to enter had many balls, so he wasn't surprised by Walter's suggestion. He said with a nod, okay. With that said, he looked sideways at his valet, Richardson. Prepare the carriage. I'll be heading over to St. Samuel Cathedral. Klein vividly remembered that his main goal was to act as a devout believer of the Evernight goddess in order to get to know the corresponding clergyman, and from there he would find a way to sneak into Cheney's Gate. Therefore, he planned to pray at the cathedral whenever he had the time to express his sincerity and get to know the members of the clergy. Yes, sir, Richardson answered politely. Before long, Klein boarded his rented luxurious four-wheeled carriage, decked out in a coat and a top hat. As he enjoyed the scenery on his journey, he sampled the black tea that was adorned with a slice of lemon. In fact, there was a tiny bar counter in the carriage, and in it, butler Walter had specially prepared golden lanty, winter black rand, and other distilled liquor, as well as all kinds of red and white wine that came from Intis. However, Klein wasn't someone who enjoyed drinking. As a beyonder, he didn't like the feeling of being tipsy. It made him recall the feeling of losing control, therefore, he used the excuse of him heading to the cathedral, so as to get his valet, Richardson, to prepare a pot of Marquis black tea. If it's possible, I would actually like a cup of sweet iced tea. It's something from the south, Klein said half-jokingly to Richardson. I will prepare it next time, Richardson immediately replied. Klein chuckled and shook his head. No, there's no need. That wouldn't appear decent. Once I'm more familiar with the neighbors, and have hosted a Desi-styled banquet, we can prepare some sweet iced tea. Heh, I believe their children will like it. When Richardson realized that he had mistaken his employer's intentions, he hurriedly said in a fluster, I will keep it in mind. It only took 20 minutes to go from 160 Buckland Street to the St. Samuel Cathedral at Phelps Street on foot. If it wasn't because he needed to hire a coachman and rent a carriage to project an image befitting his status, Klein would rather walk over to digest his food and strengthen his body. Soon, the carriage stopped along the square outside the cathedral. Klein held his golden-laid cane, got out of the carriage, and stopped there to enjoy the pigeons' dance. After entering the cathedral and coming to the main prayer hall, he passed his top hat and cane to Richardson. He found a seat near the aisle and sat down. He lowered his head, clasped his hands, and seriously and silently prayed. Richardson sat behind him to his side, putting the items in place as he glanced at the dark sacred emblem on the altar. He then closed his eyes. In the serene atmosphere, Klein felt his spirituality lightly scatter. He wasn't too surprised by this, because the praying masses in the cathedral would encounter something similar. The tiny bits of spirituality that carried pious beliefs gathered together to provide power to the Cheney's Gate seals underground. After an unknown period of time, his spiritual perception triggered as he opened his eyes and looked diagonally across him. Standing there was an elder dressed in a black clergyman robe. His hair was sparse, and his face looked pale. He resembled a dead man. From afar, he had a cold aura with a lacking expression. He blended in with the prayer hall's dark environment to a certain extent. A keeper. Klein made a judgment from a single glance. He closed his eyes again and continued praying. Of course, he had already remembered the man's facial features. Big nose, grayish-blue eyes, loose facial skin, and no facial hair. The elder dressed as a clergyman had sat down as well. He focused on praying to the goddess. Inside the prayer hall, the wall in front had a few holes. Pure light shone in from them like resplendent stars. It made the dark environment appear gentle and holy. Time ticked by as Klein felt his spiritual perception trigger again. He carefully opened his eyes and saw that the black-robed keeper had left his seat and entered a passageway to the side. That should lead to the back of the cathedral. The keepers stay inside the cathedral. They have no family and don't have their own residences. From their conditions, it's not that surprising either. Furthermore, the keepers of Cheney's Gate are monitored by the bishops, so it's a normal precaution. This means that I have to become friends with the priests and bishops of St. Samuel Cathedral to obtain the freedom to enter the area at the back of the cathedral. Klein didn't sneak any more glances as he closed his eyes and considered various problems. After some time, he slowly got up and walked to the altar. Standing in front of the donation box, he took out £50 in cash and devoutly threw it in. This made the bishop and priest on duty look over. Their gaze turned friendly as they remembered his appearance. After doing that, Klein nodded gently at the clergyman, turned around, and walked down the aisle towards the exit. Richardson held his hat and cane and followed closely behind. Once out the prayer hall, he walked towards the main entrance alongside a series of intricate murals and colored pane windows that lined the top. At this point, a few figures walked in. Leading them was a middle-aged man with long sideburns and soft facial features. He wore a black trench coat without any gloves, nor did he carry a cane. Behind him was a young man dressed in a similar trench coat. He had black hair and green eyes, and he looked handsome with his randomly styled hair. He looked like he hadn't combed it after waking up in the morning. Klein was especially familiar with his looks and figure. It felt as though they hadn't seen each other for years. Leonard Mitchell. Klein's pupils constricted a little, but he didn't stop at all. He maintained his pace and stride, and he walked towards the few nighthawks in black trench coats. Yes, Klein was certain that they were nighthawks. When they met, he casually swept a gaze at Leonard and company before passing them and walking towards the main entrance. The main entrance was open, and the clouds outside were thin. There was plenty of sunlight and pigeons were flying. Leonard Mitchell glanced at the believers who walked past him out of boredom, and he retracted his gaze. He said with a sigh, "I hope we can stay in Backland for a few days this time to have a good rest." The case this time wasn't only dangerous and thrilling, but it also required us to be tense the entire time. His team of Red Gloves had just cracked a human skin-donning devil case, and they had captured 2 targets. This seemed easy on the surface, but it wasn't simple at all. They went through plenty of setbacks and tribulations before completing the mission with great difficulty. Every member was exhausted both in mind and body. Captain Soest shook his head with a smile. "This is the life of us Red Gloves. You should have known that this would be how it would be back when you chose to join. However, congratulations on advancing to Sol Assure." Leonard Mitchell curled his lips into a smile. "It's slower than I had expected. Also, Captain Soest, you've finally reached Sequence 5. This isn't a problem with the Church. If I could have endured it better, I could have become a spirit warlock earlier." Soest wiped his smile away as he walked into the prayer hall's corridor. "Pray to the goddess. It will effectively eliminate your mental stress, allowing you to recover." As he spoke, the team of Red Gloves entered the dark and serene hall as they found a spot to sit down. Leonard was just about to focus on praying when he suddenly heard a slightly aged voice ring in his mind. "That person from just now is problematic." "Who?" Leonard kept his head down as he asked with a suppressed voice. The slightly aged voice replied, "One of the men you met at the entrance. I'm living in your body, and my strength hasn't recovered, so I wasn't able to see too clearly." Leonard recalled and asked softly, "What do you mean by problematic?" "He has an ancient aura. A beyonder who has lived for a very long period of time." Leonard mumbled, "I will try to investigate." Simultaneously, he thought, "Old man must be hiding certain things. He seldom volunteers to tell me that someone is problematic, yet be so vague about it. After I find the target and confirm that there's no danger for the time being, I'll leave it. I don't want to be embroiled in the conflict of some undying monsters from the fourth epoch. If that person will really bring about a calamity, I'll directly report it to the Archbishop. In an apartment in Sherwood Borough. This the money I borrowed from you. Furs handed £220 to Zio. She had already received the £100 from Mr. Moon and the £500 from Ma'am Hermit. Zio Dericha grabbed at her messy blonde, unsmooth hair, looked at the money, and raised her head to look at Furs. She blurted, "You really are involved in illegal gambling? I have to tell you that such gambling must be a scam and a trap. They let you win in order to make you lose more. Even though you're a trick master and have a chance of fooling them, such gambling scams might have other beyonders hiding in it." "Stop, stop, stop." Furs lowered her hands. She said in bemused anger, "Do I look like someone who will participate in illegal gambling?" "Yes." Zio didn't hesitate in her reply. "If I didn't stop you, you wouldn't just be smoking cigarettes, you'd even be smoking cannabis. That's because I needed to numb myself due to the pain brought by the full moon's ravings. I no longer need to." Furs didn't debate with Zio as she directly explained, "I sold the mysticism knowledge I know at a Beyonder gathering." "Heh, that person was very generous and had paid several £100. Is that so?" Zio instantly threw the problem to the back of her mind and said, "There's been a new Beyonder gathering that appeared recently in East Borough. I've been invited." "A new Beyonder gathering?" Furs was first taken aback before feeling a sense of anticipation. According to her teacher, Dorian Gray, and Mr. Fool, she knew that Louis Veen was an oracle of the Aurora Order. His arrival in Backlund was likely to replace the missing Mr. A, so as to rebuild the Aurora Order faction in this big city. Therefore, there was a solid chance that he had disguised himself to organize a new Beyonder gathering. Furs thought for a moment and said seemingly mindlessly to Zio, "Are you going to join it?" "Of course, I have to prepare the interrogator formula potion," Zio answered decisively. Furs nodded and covered her mouth to yawn. "Remember to bring me along when you have the privilege of inviting a new member."